Welcome to our ERO channel. Please enjoy this educational and informative video documentary about Nigeria, with a focus on the infant mortality rate in the country. This video documentary is part one of a two-part series. The video will be very detailed, and for the benefit of our viewers, delve into the historical records. This is intentional because it provides context and background on governance, the austerity program, the structural adjustment program, and the key players in the past 5 decades. We also explore how these programs and governance impacted the high infant mortality rate in Nigeria. Enjoy the video. Please like, share, and subscribe.
Progress is being made in reducing Nigeria's infant mortality rate, though more work remains. We acknowledge the publicly available data from international organizations like the UN, World Health Organization, UNICEF, World Bank Group, IMF, and others. Special thanks go to the governments and people of the US, as well as Nigeria, Ghana, and Saudi Arabia, for contributing their data to these organizations. We also appreciate the doctors, nurses, midwives, NGOs, and volunteers dedicated to infant care, especially in Nigeria, the focus of this video. Your efforts are deeply valued. Thank you. The learning objectives of this video are displayed on your screen. In Part 1, we provide an overview of Nigeria's geography, economy, population, and natural resources. We define infant mortality rate and present historical projections based on data from the 1960s and 1970s with comparisons to Ghana. We then explore the data during the Azikiwe and Shagari administrations, the impact of austerity measures, and the consequences of the Babangida and Abacha military regimes. This includes the IMF World Bank Structural Adjustment Program, its negative effects on Nigeria's economy, and the resulting healthcare brain drain that worsened the infant mortality rate. This video is recommended for a global audience. On your screen is a map of Nigeria and the neighboring countries that share a border with it. Nigeria is located in West Africa. The capital is Abuja, which is centrally located. The countries that share a border with Nigeria are Cameroon and Chad to the east, Benin Republic to the west, Niger Republic to the north, and Lake Chad to the northeast. To the south of Nigeria, along the coastline, is the Gulf of Guinea. Nigeria is the most populous black country in the world, with a population of 229 million people, based on United Nations data projection in 2024. The ethnic groups are Hausa 30%, Yoruba 15.5%, Igbo 15.2%, Fulani 6%, Tiv 2.4%, Kanuri Beriberi 2.4%, Ibibio 1.8%, Ijaw 1.8%, other 24.9%. On your screen is Nigeria's population projection. In 1970, the population was around 56 million, rising to 84 million by 1985. Despite some political instability and coups, the healthcare system remained relatively well-funded, with new universities training doctors and nurses. The naira was strong compared to foreign currencies, attracting expatriate healthcare workers whose expertise helped reduce infant mortality rates. For context, in 1973, 3 years after the Civil War, $1 exchanged for 66 kobo, with 1 naira equal to 100 kobo. Population size, land, the availability of natural resources, the GDP and availability of trained healthcare personnel impacts the infant mortality rate of a country. In the year 2000, the UN reported a population of 123 million people in Nigeria. By the year 2027, the population of Nigeria is expected to double to 246 million people, this within a 27-year period. The size and resources of Nigeria, including its GDP, appear inadequate to maintain a population increase of this size in this short period of time. For the benefit of our viewers and to put the population of Nigeria and the land size in perspective, on your screen is a map of Nigeria compared to the map of Texas, USA. Nigeria is approximately 1.4 times the size of Texas. Texas has a population of approximately 31 million people as of 2024. The land size of Nigeria and that of Texas are at the bottom of your screen. Nigeria has abundant natural resources such as natural gas, petroleum, iron ore, gold, zinc, coal, tin. The GDP based on 2024 estimate, approximately $253 billion, ranking 53rd in the world. GDP per capita, $1,621. The most abundant export is crude oil. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration website, Nigeria holds the largest natural gas reserves on the continent, and according to BP's estimates in its June 2022 statistical review of world energy, it was ranked 6th globally among exporters of liquefied natural gas in 2021. Let's focus on the infant mortality rate, defined by the World Health Organization as the number of infants dying before age 1 per 1,000 live births in a year. It reflects how well the most vulnerable, such as infants, are cared for. It also indicates the state of a country's healthcare system. Understanding this data aids in planning strategies to reduce infant deaths. In 2022, Nigeria's infant mortality rate was 68.54, compared to 5.35 in the US. Units are deaths per 1,000 live births, 13 times higher in Nigeria compared to the US. Let's review the reduction in Nigeria's infant mortality rate from 1964 to 1980. On your screen is our optimistic projection, showing what could have been achieved if the reduction rate had continued without political instability from military coups. This scenario suggests Nigeria could have reached 20 deaths per 1,000 live births by 2005. Our conservative projection, with a slower decline, suggests reaching that goal by 2022. The actual data is more sobering. The graphs, excluding projections, are based on UN data available at childmortality.org. On your screen is a graph showing the infant mortality rate in Ghana. For those who believe our projections for Nigeria's infant mortality rate were either too optimistic or not conservative enough, we present this graph of our projections for Ghana, a neighbouring West African country. Like Nigeria, Ghana has faced challenges such as military coups that have hindered the growth of its healthcare sector and economy. Our conservative projection for Ghana is close to the actual reported infant mortality rate, demonstrating that it is possible to focus on reducing infant mortality and achieve substantial progress. The graph data, excluding projections, is sourced from UN data available at childmortality.org. With these as background, let us get into the details of past decades in Nigeria. Between 1970 and approximately 1981 was the period of the oil boom, depicted on your screen. This was a period when Nigeria had a lot of wealth due to the discovery of oil. This period of wealth led to an improvement in the standard of living of the populace, and many Nigerians were lifted out of poverty. The availability of highly skilled professionals, doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers, including expatriates working in the healthcare sector, led to a rapid and sustained reduction in the infant mortality rate in Nigeria, as depicted in the graph. In 1966, the Nigerian military, through a coup, deposed the democratically elected government in the First Republic. At that time, the President of Nigeria was Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, popularly known as the Great Zik of Africa. The Prime Minister was the well-respected and beloved Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, who was assassinated during the coup. On your screen is Dr. Moses Mayakadunmi, specialist gynecologist and obstetrician who was the Minister of Health in the First Republic. On the infant mortality rate graph of Nigeria on your screen, the earliest data are from 1964. We therefore projected 4.1 in 1963, based on the average of the reduction in the infant mortality rate from 1964 to 1966. In 1966, it was 185.57. Units are deaths per 1,000 live births. The absolute reduction in infant mortality rate was 12.43 in simple terms over 3 years. This, in simple terms, was a 4% reduction per year. No other administration or military regime has been able to match this rate of reduction of infant mortality. If the 4% per year rate of reduction in infant mortality had been maintained by successive administrations, Nigeria would have achieved an infant mortality rate of 20 deaths per 1,000 live births by 2005. Sadly, Nigerians' infants born since then have been paying a very heavy price with their lives. The Second Republic began when the military regime of General Obasanjo, who ruled Nigeria from 1976 to 1979, transferred power to a democratically elected president, Shehu Shagari, who was in office from 1979 to 1983. Unfortunately, his administration was subsequently removed from office by another coup led by General Babangida. The Shagari administration was accused of rampant corruption and economic mismanagement by the opposition and the military. The administration introduced austerity measures and stabilization policies from 1981 to 1982, aimed at reducing the federal deficit, cutting costs and expenditure. On your screen is the publication by Professor Nkemdili Nonyelu in the African Journal of Business Management, July 2013. The author elegantly reviewed the adverse impact of the austerity measures on the Nigerian family. Additionally, the austerity measures also impacted the vulnerable in the population, reflected in the high infant mortality rate. In the graph on your screen, we point out the period of the Shagari administration, the slowing of the pace of the infant mortality rate, beginning in 1981 when the austerity measures were introduced. This flattening of the graph of the infant mortality rate continued through the end of the Shagari administration in 1983. The progress made in the rapid and sustained reduction in the high infant mortality rate from the 1960s and 70s was lost. In simple terms, the Shagari administration over a 4-year period reduced the infant mortality rate by approximately 6 points, from 128.62 in 1979 to 122.93 in 1983. Units are deaths per 1,000 live births, in simple terms. This was approximately 1.5 points per year in simple terms. This was very low and non-substantive. Black infants continued to die. Nigerians pushed back by protesting the harsh economic conditions caused by the austerity measures of the Shagari administration. The Minister of Finance was Sunday Esang. The Minister of National Planning was Ibun Oyagbola. These protests were born out of patriotic zeal for the country. The government should have reversed course. Nigerians were frustrated that their government was insensitive to the plight of the people. Wages were stagnant, inflation was high, and many Nigerians became poorer because of the exorbitant price of food, petrol and transportation, which doubled or tripled within weeks. Import licenses were granted to the few party favourites of the administration, further worsening the increases in food prices due to hoarding and price gouging. Many healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, were forced to leave the country in order to provide for their families because of the harsh economic conditions, further contributing to the high infant mortality rate. General Ibrahim Babangida came to power through a military coup and ruled Nigeria from 1985 to 1993. The Structural Adjustment Program was recommended to the Nigerian government by the World Bank International Monetary Fund. These institutions over several decades through sound policies have brought positive and productive changes worldwide. We applaud the good work they have been doing. However, the Structural Adjustment Program in Nigeria, instituted in 1986 to 1990, is remembered by Nigerians and other Africans as unnecessarily harsh, punitive, and detrimental to the economy of Nigeria, and may have contributed to the high infant mortality rate in the country. The Babangida military regime accepted the recommendations of these international institutions and enforced their programs. Nigerians protested the introduction of the Structural Adjustment Program, which came after the austerity measures of the Shagari administration. When the Structural Adjustment Program was instituted in Nigeria, Alden W. Clausen was the president of the World Bank. He was succeeded by Baba Conable. The managing directors of the IMF were Jacques de la Rosière, who was succeeded by Michel Camdessus. These institutions noted that economic reforms were needed by Nigeria and other African countries to restructure and diversify their economies from oil, achieve fiscal stability, and promote private-led development. Key strategies were adopting realistic exchange rates, devaluation of the currency, tariff rationalization, trade liberalization, and the privatization of public enterprises. However, it became clear that the implementation of these programs led to the collapse of many African economies, including Nigeria's. Nigerians were plunged into poverty and many sectors of the economy collapsed, including the healthcare sector, triggering an exodus of professionals, physicians, and nurses. This exodus of Nigerian professionals to the US, EU, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other countries was known as the brain drain. The Structural Adjustment Program unwittingly had contributed to the high infant mortality rate. Many Nigerians and civil society groups led anti-SAP protests. The world-renowned economist, the late Professor Sam Aluko, said, "There is an alternative even to death, which is living. The Structural Adjustment Program is the kiss of death." Gani Fawehinmi, the late civil rights lawyer, led several of these anti-SAP protests. He was arrested and jailed by the Babangida military regime. Civil society was actively involved in protests about the Structural Adjustment Program. The Nigeria Labour Congress took an active part in organising these protests, led by late Comrade Ali Kiroma, president of the NLC. Other influential Nigerians, such as the Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, the internationally renowned author, the late Chinua Achebe, all protested the Structural Adjustment Program. The Minister of Health in the Babangida regime was Professor Ransom Kuti, a well-respected and internationally recognized pediatrician. In the 8-year period of the Babangida regime, the infant mortality rate remained at 123 deaths per 1,000 live births. This is sobering and very sad news. The very possibility exists that were he not the Minister of Health, who brought to the office all his training, professionalism and expertise, the infant mortality rate could have been worse. Regarding the economy, it continued to weaken due to the Structural Adjustment Program. In 1985, $1 exchanged for 89 kobo. At the end of the Babangida regime, The naira had been devalued and $1 exchanged for 17 naira and 30 kobo. There were no appreciable increases in wages. The brain drain continued and with it a high infant mortality rate. Black infant deaths continued. Under General Babangida's regime in Nigeria, fuel prices rose by 250%, from 20 to 70 kobo per litre. Despite severe economic hardship, including rising food prices and stagnant wages, the government suppressed dissent, closing schools and banning the National Association of Nigerian Students. Peaceful protests continued, but the regime's unpopular structural adjustment program further fueled a brain drain, worsening healthcare shortages and thereby contributing to the high infant mortality rate. Nigerians were dissatisfied that Babangida's military regime and its economic advisers lacked homegrown solutions to the country's economic challenges. Were they unprepared to manage the economy, leading them to accept harmful policies? Did they not consider the bad consequences this policy could have on black infants nationwide? Perhaps the advisers, highly accomplished individuals listed on your screen, were simply ignored. Another issue could have been the lack of diversity, especially the near absence of women, who, as mothers, might have better understood the pain of families losing infants. By means of a coup, General Babangida was deposed and General Sani Abacha replaced him. He ruled Nigeria from 1993 to 1998 when he expired in office. These were volatile years in Nigeria. Ken Saro-Wiwa, a young, brilliant playwright and environmental activist from the oil-producing Ogoni region of Nigeria, was imprisoned by the regime. Despite calls both within Nigeria and internationally by his family, the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, Gani Fawehinmi, the civil rights lawyer, many civil groups in Nigeria and leaders of several African countries. He and 8 others were executed by the regime. The influential and well-respected Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, Emeka Anyaoku, protested the imprisonment of Ken Saro-Wiwa and worked vigorously for his release. The execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa by the Abacha regime provoked international outrage and resulted in Nigeria's suspension from the Commonwealth of Nations for over 3 years. All these political and social instability contributed to a high infant mortality rate. On your screen is the infant mortality rate during the Abacha regime, 1993 to 1998. The ministers of health who served in that regime were Prince Julius Adelusi Adeloye, a pharmacist, Dr. Dalhatu Tafida, Ihechukwu Madubuike, Ph.D., and Rear Admiral Jubril Ayinla. The infant mortality rate in 1993 was 123.05 and 115.29 in 1998. Units are deaths per 1,000 live births. This, in simple terms, represented an approximately 8-point reduction in infant mortality rate over the 5-year rule of the Abacha regime, translating to a 1.6-point reduction per year in simple terms. This meant no substantive gains were made in reducing the infant mortality rate during the Abacha regime. Sadly, black infant lives continued to be lost. Nigerians are very smart and take issue with the adoption of a bad program and criticize it and not the person or persons. Ultimately, the austerity measures and structural adjustment program adversely changed the economic prosperity of Nigeria with a consequence of contributing to a high infant mortality rate. Going forward, the lesson learned is to always consider all the ramifications of policies on every segment of society. In particular, the vulnerable, such as infants and children. Specific exceptions should be made for the health sector when these programs are crafted. In retrospect, it appears the focus was on the program, and not the human beings it adversely impacted. For those who now romanticize military rule in Nigeria, it is important to remember that it is a dictatorship, where taxpayer-funded weapons are used against citizens to enforce compliance. Military rule hinders a nation's progress, including its economy, healthcare, and political stability, often leading to higher infant mortality rates due to a lack of healthcare expertise, focus, and direction. More recent examples are Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger Republic, where political instability under military dictatorships has contributed to high infant mortality rates. We recently made a documentary highlighting this issue. In contrast, democratic governance, where citizens can speak without fear, is far superior. The US, UK, EU, Nigeria, ECOWAS and other democracies are on the right side of history for continuing to advocate for democracy worldwide and its enduring benefit. On your screen is a world map showing the infant mortality rate based on 2022 data. The color key is in the lower left corner. Lighter colors indicate lower rates. Countries like the USA, UK, EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE have low infant mortality rates because they prioritize health, especially infant survival. Nigeria, as the most populous black country, should lead by example. The government must ensure transparent, state-by-state data to identify and address areas with the highest rates. Black lives should matter in Nigeria, the most populous black nation. Earlier on, we mentioned some factors that impact infant mortality, such as population size and GDP. The total fertility rate in Nigeria, top left graph, is high at 5.1, Ghana 3.5, and Saudi Arabia 2.4 units are births per woman. The crude birth rate in Nigeria, top right graph, is also high at 37, Ghana 27, Saudi Arabia 17 units are per 1,000 people. Of these countries, Nigeria has the lowest GDP per capita at 162.1, Ghana 2,238.2, Saudi Arabia 28,895 and the US, for comparison, at 81,695.2 units are US dollar. The logical conclusion from the data is that the economy of Nigeria, reflected in the GDP per capita, is inadequate to support the rapid population size. Thank you for watching part 1 of this video documentary. The learning objectives projected on your screen have been met. The high infant mortality rate in Nigeria has gone on for far too long. The data are in the public domain for the world to see. It should be obvious from this presentation. And the data that, sadly, reducing the high infant mortality rate does not appear to be a top priority of the government. We acknowledge that the people of Nigeria also have responsibilities regarding the high infant mortality rate. We earlier pointed out the high population growth rate and the lack of infrastructure and healthcare personnel to support it. This can be addressed by country-wide engaging and sustained family planning education programs.
In part 2 of this video documentary, we will further explore the emergence of democracy in Nigeria, the infant mortality rate in a democracy. We will explore the Japa phenomenon of the 2020s and how these impact the high infant mortality rate in Nigeria. We will also fully explore the number of black infant lives lost based on our projections, other key causes of high infant mortality rate, and provide recommendations to reduce it. The link to the report of the Structural Adjustment Program is provided on your screen. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more insightful, informative, and educational content to a wider audience. This has been a presentation of Aero Channel in collaboration with the Pomulero Media LLC.